Welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Contigiani. I'm an assistant professor at The Ohio State University, and this event is co-organized with the Cheng Gao, University of Michigan, who you will meet in a few seconds. So this is our second STR teaching discussion this semester, and today we'll talk about how to incorporate research into teaching. And we really kind of try to look at basically at the intersection between research and teaching. We look at both how we can put research into teaching, but also we'll look at how we can do research through teaching. So we're kind of gonna look at both directions of that relationship. We have three really outstanding speakers that we'll introduce in a second. Just a couple of logistics points. So the event is gonna be about an hour. And you're most welcome to put questions or comments in the chat. We'll have a lot of space for discussion. With that, I'm happy to have Heather come in and say hi. Thank you very much, Heather, for joining us.
Okay, so I just want to say welcome on behalf of the STR division. I'm division chair this year. Andrea and Cheng have organized this. They are serving on the teaching committee. We always get a lot of interest from our members in terms of the teaching events that we offer. And so we're thankful to, we're going to go in Brian, Rita, and Linus order when we first go. So I want to thank them for participating today and also for agreeing to have this recorded. We will put this up on our STR homepage, so it'll be available for people to view afterward. But I want to thank the organizers and I want to thank the speakers today for taking their time and for doing this teaching event for our STR division members. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. My name is Cheng Gao. I'm just going to introduce the speakers briefly. So we have Linus Dahlander, we have Rita Katila, and we have Brian Silverman. In the interest of time, I'm just going to say that they're all three are renowned scholars and also renowned teachers. They've won numerous research awards as well as teaching awards, and all three of them have held administrative leadership positions that deal with the intersection of research and teaching. So we're really delighted to have them for this event. We're going to keep this short just to save more time. Next slide, please. So here's the roadmap. So there are two broad questions we're going to cover. How do you use research to inform strategy teaching? How do you do research through strategy teaching? And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. We'll also have a mini Q&A after the first question as well. So Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Cheng, very much. And we're ready to get started here. So the first sort of big topic we would love to explore with our speakers is how to essentially use research to shape and design teaching. And we're happy to hear comments and thoughts on really on any aspect of that. So with that, I believe we're going to start with Brian going first. Thank you, Brian.
Yes, hi, thanks. First, thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody here. And what I'm going to talk about is a little bit, actually, given that I know that the others are going to talk about how they bring research specifically into their teaching, I want to touch a bit on why I think it's important for us to do that, and also touch on how to get students excited about the fact that we're bringing research into teaching. And then if I have time, I'll also talk about what I do. So first, this is true for all faculty. I think this may be particularly true if you happen to be at a research institution. If you're teaching, but even if you're teaching institution, it's true. I mean, people can watch videos on and learn all sorts of things on YouTube. We have to convince students that they should be paying money in order to come to our programs. And if you're at a research institution and you're a faculty member, you're expensive because you're teaching relatively few courses because you're supposed to be doing research. And so tuitions at these institutions typically end up being higher than at many other schools. And we've got to persuade students that the education is worth that. There are a few schools that have a brand name that seems to be enough to get folks, but for the rest of us, mere mortals, the best explanation or rationale that I've been able to come up with talking to colleagues at the Rotman School is that it's got to be that by learning from people who are at the forefront of knowledge, that's going to be beneficial for your careers going forward. And so the point is, we bring research in, you get to see what's at the cutting edge, maybe even before other people get to see it or think about it. And that's useful for you being the smartest person in the room when you go out and try to get a job. To try to motivate that with students, what I typically do in my class pretty early on, and I'm not the only one at the Rotman School, and I know there are others out who will do it, is try to put up a few slides and just point out to students the long gestation time from research to something being widely accepted in the business world. And so you put up something, Michael Porter, compared to the 5 forces, but you show, look, Bain is working on this in the 30s, Mason in the 50s, and then finally it gets popularized in the 80s, or Coase and Williamson, and then the outsourcing and vertical integration movement, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it can be motivating to students to say, look, you walk in anytime after Porter publishes the book and everyone's reading it, and you say, well, we have to think about industry structure, and they say, yeah, we read that book too. But if you know about it ahead of time, and in a couple of years before the book comes out, you're going into your job interview or your manager, you're talking to folks at your firm, and you say, we should be thinking about industry characteristics because you've seen the research, you're the smartest person in the room. So the basic idea that I try to use to convince students that it's worth their time to listen to the research I'm trying to instill in the course is this idea that by being on the cutting edge, being a little ahead of what's in the popular press, you can be that smartest person in the room. I guess in terms of how I do it, for now, I'm just going to say one thing and turn it over to Linus and Rita to give more on this. I'll just say that when I think about teaching in general, there are just 3 things I spend my time on right now. I spend time thinking for the course or for each day, what are the key points I want the students to walk away with? What do I want the board to look like at the end of the class? I don't really care how I get there, what order things come out, but what is it going to look like at the end of the class? Because that's the visual representation of the key points. And then what is the most vivid, catchy, memorable way, easy to digest way to illustrate the ideas from research that I want to bring into the class discussion. So for me, I spend a huge amount of time focusing on, this is the research idea I want to bring in. What's the example I can give that students will remember so that it actually sticks with them? I think I could go on forever, but in the interest of time, I will stop there. Always happy to talk about specific examples, but let me turn it over to Rita and Linus for the next bit.
I think I go next. Brian, thank you for teeing up the discussion so nicely. That was wonderful. And hello, friends. I see so many friends I haven't seen for a long time. So thank you for joining us today. My job was to give you a few examples of this research to teaching translation that I've tried to do over the past, 10, 20 years or so. So I wanted to introduce 2 ideas. One idea is sort of research as bookends for each class session. That's the first idea. And then the second idea I wanted to talk about is a kind of a Hollywood-Bollywood format for research seminars and PhD classes. So I'll get to what that is, but I kind of have this movie book entertainment theme going on, as I realized in my comments. So the first comment is about these research bookends. So I first started teaching strategy at Stanford, and I was asked, or I had a privilege to sit in the legendary Kathy Eisenhardt's technology strategy class. So I was sitting at the back of the class on the floor. The classroom was packed every time, and I was furiously taking notes of how she is teaching. And much like Brian was saying, she had a very good visual idea of what at the end of the class, what the takeaway should be. So after the first half of the quarter, I started seeing some patterns emerge. And what was really important for us today was Kathy started and ended the class always the same way. I think she calls it still like a Hollywood movie. There's a clear beginning, there's middle, and then there's end. So the middle is the big chunk. It's the case discussion. But what she really effectively did every single time I was listening to that class, and what I then ended up adopting for my own teaching is this research bookends idea. So that's my term, not hers. So what does it mean? So start of the class, always a research framework. So sometimes it's sort of more managerial bent. Could be 5 forces, barriers to entry, sometimes even more research oriented like resource-based U or TCE. So depending on the case of the day. if you teach a case on Apple, she would start the class with 5 4Cs. Okay, so that's the beginning. What was really even more interesting is how she always ended the class. So she would always end the class with a research brief. So how does the case relate to what's going on in terms of research in our group? So as a side note, I kind of realized later that making those bridges as you prep for class helps you as a researcher as well. You're forced to think beyond the case. But even more importantly, in the classroom setting, it really helps students deal with ambiguity in the real world when the case does not match exactly what is happening. So going back to the Apple case. So for example, at the end, Kathy's research brief would end around, what does the group's current research say, let's say, about power of big platforms, antitrust, digital software in general. So really tying it back to the Apple case, but also to digital ecosystems more broadly. So in any class session, as I think about how I teach, the end of the class is always rushed. But Kathy's, I think the most important lesson I learned that first quarter was Kathy teaching me that students, whether it's undergrads, master's students, MBAs, they would actually start not packing their stuff, but rather they would pay attention all the way to the end, because Kathy was giving them something that they don't hear anywhere else, and that's our research. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is about this Hollywood-Bollywood format for teaching. So a couple of years ago, I redesigned my PhD seminar. So it was a wonderful experience to review all of the research in the strategy field again, something that you probably only get to do once in a lifetime when you're preparing for a comprehensive exam as a PhD student. So I got a second chance, so redesigning this class. And I realized actually there is benefit of teaching that ties back to research when you're doing that. But that's not exactly the format. So what I did differently when I designed this class, which turned out to be a really interesting experiment, is a format. So I learned this actually from another great teacher who is teaching me a dance class. So I have an instructor who plays 2 similar songs back to back in the dance class. So in terms of rhythm, so like both songs would have 8 beats that repeat and other similar structures. So one Hollywood song followed by a Bollywood song. So what she does in terms of teaching is genius. So I'm sure there's a lot of class prep involved in how she does this, but she uses the same dance choreography for both of these songs. So what I did for my PhD class, I decided to adopt the same idea. So in our world, choreography would translate to theory or theory frameworks of the day. Maybe there's in your PhD seminar, there's a session on TCE, another on RBV, then there's a session on platforms, etc. So in the strategy PhD seminar, we would first have a discussion from the research side of the theory. So that's academic. That's kind of the Hollywood format, right? And then the second half of the class, or maybe it was kind of the last third of the class, we would have the Bollywood format, which would be the same choreography, the same theory, but how do you teach this idea, this theory in an MBA or undergrad classroom? So same choreography, different context. So turns out this was actually unexpectedly popular and interesting to PhD students. It helped us kind of forming these teaching research connections, helped us redevelop and think through our research ideas, and also, I hope, really prep PhD students for future teaching of their own. So those were my 2 ideas, bookends in each class, and then the Hollywood-Bollywood format. And now I'm turning it over to Linus for more examples of how to turn research into teaching.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. I see many people who are participants here that I think about as much better teachers and also researchers than myself, so I'm humbled to be here and present some of my own insights. I think I've changed my view a bit when it comes to teaching, and I think one of the nice things about being at my school is that we have some room for experimenting with different kinds of teaching. And the one thing that I've changed over the years is to become much more active in actually bringing real research into the teaching that I do. And oftentimes these days, more than just teaching a case, I actually try to bring in research and talk about research in the classroom with executives, executive MBAs, and so forth. And I have a couple of rules for the kind of research that I implement myself. I try to use research that is using plain language that illustrate a trade-off or a core concept. The one thing that I learned about implementing research in the classroom, and I think it links into what Rita said about Kathy as well, is that when I describe my research or someone else's research, I really try to make the null hypothesis credible, just as if you are to convince reviewers that this is like the best thing ever. And I explain why did we do this project to begin with, and I push the students to think about what we will find before seeing the findings. And I think I do this to sort of like create like a curiosity gap in their knowledge. Like, look, they could go both ways. You could go in direction A or direction B, and I ask them to vote. I ask them to come up with some kind of prediction about the effects that you will find. And sometimes I even have like people voting inside the class. This was easier when it was online to do this, even with forecast kinds of exercises. And I usually have a picture of the gorillas of the zoo in Berlin in the background. And after they voted, I usually, if I've done a good job building up a credible null, I can show them that they're usually as accurate as the predictions of the gorillas. And then you sort of create like a curiosity among the students, like, look, I should know better about this particular thing. Like, why is it that half of the class actually got this wrong? And essentially showcasing that this is something that they don't know. And I think this actually makes it easier to talk about research, because I think in the beginning when I came here, I had like this impression, and maybe this was like driven by convention in the field, that sometimes we try to dumb down research and make it almost too accessible. And I still try to convert my findings into like managerial journals like HBR and MIT Sloan Management Review and so forth. But I really think that my obligation as a professor, and it goes back to Brian's point as well, is to really sort of illustrate the beauty of research, that this is important, kind of effect in society, and showcase sometimes that it's actually hard. So sometimes I talk about very difficult things in class of how this particular project was done, what you can learn from it, what were some of the pitfalls that they were experimenting with in a particular case. And I think the students come to appreciate science a lot more as a result from it. So for example, I have many students that are working on A/B testing inside their companies. And the amazing thing about them is that, sure, they can run A/B testing and come up with some conclusion about whether strategy A or B is the better one. But sometimes they test like completely the wrong kinds of hypotheses to begin with. And they're not actually betting against conventional wisdom, so they don't get any outside returns. So then I talk about like what is actually a good hypothesis to begin with, and really like fundamental stuff about what we know from science to create something that is meaningful for them in the very end. So I think my main objective in the very end is to, at least for some student, showcase them the beauty of research and the beauty of what we do, and not just only give them like the HBR and the very glossy version of the slides that I have, but something that is actually somewhat more hard to digest in the very end of the sessions, or even devote like a whole session to talk about like a field experiment or some recent result that is just coming out that would be something that have implications for the students in the class. And I think that usually creates a surprising amount of interest, that actually they start to begin to realize that research is something that is super important and something that they should care fundamentally deeply about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks. We have a couple questions, so I think we can go with them now. And also I will invite the three of you to really, if you have any comments to make based on another speaker's comment, please do that. That's also very, very interesting for us. I think we have, I believe, Heather and Kevin. You folks want to ask your questions?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I was just asking a very practical question. So I actually use research in my class. Sometimes research that I've done that's not on topics that tend to be covered very well. So for example, divestment is something that I've done research on. And so, since I've used the population of US MNCs, I can talk about divestment in foreign countries and some of the results that I have. And over the years, I started by actually saying, try to, just skim this article, which is a published article, and get very different reactions from undergrads to MBAs. Obviously, PhDs have to read that stuff, but like the undergrads and the MBAs, some of them really get very removed and sort of feel like they don't know the econometrics, and they don't really make it to the end. So over time, I've really kind of changed that and highlighted some of the findings that I think are interesting, or highlighted some pages or some tables that I think they might want to look at. So I'm just wondering what your experience has been in terms of actually bringing the research in. Do you ask students to read the articles? Do you summarize? Do you bring it as extra at the end as a bookend, or kind of what is your approach been?
I can get us started quickly. I think, Heather, that's a great question. So I think video abstracts that SMJ, SEJ, and others, AMJ, I think it's optional or almost required these days. They are a lifesaver. So it's so much easier to add a video link to your syllabus and ask students to watch something than ask them to read something. So I think that's been fantastic. And I remember also as a junior scholar being very shy about including my own work, even if I took the extra step of having, an HBR write-up or, California Management Review write-up. I was too shy to think that anybody would be interested to read it. But now I've started kind of shamelessly also including those links in my syllabus. I'm wondering what others are doing, but yeah, that's what I do.
And I'm happy to follow up. Similarly, if I'm inferring right from what Rita says, I don't usually require the students to read the original articles. My syllabus is pretty much peppered with sort of the basic stuff, which maybe these video links, they may be more practitioner-oriented versions of the research, but then for the keener, and then there you have the things for people to really read. And I'm always pleasantly surprised that a decent number of students are interested in, are keeners, but it's definitely not 100% of them. So that's my way of dealing with it. And finally, on that particular note, the asynchronous video, one nice thing that came out of the last couple of years is I was forced to become much more comfortable with asynchronous videos, and those are a great way for me to pontificate about research ideas that I can then inflict on the students.
So I also have like the more accessible things as the required readings. I often post additional links that this comes from this academic paper, and if you're interested, follow this link. Now I teach much more online, and the beauty of that is that we can also use link tracking. So I usually use link tracking of the behaviors of the students. And the amazing thing about this is that you can see how many of them, even if it's completely optional, actually click on the academic article. And then I think like, even if I can get like 25% of the students to read Brian Silverman's article or Rita's paper on something that is just coming out, then I think it's like a win for me that I actually got them to become more interested in research as well. Like, I don't think it's necessary for them to read it, but at least I got someone to become interested in it.
Well, thank you folks very much. There is a great question by Leo. Leo, are you okay if we keep that for the final segment of the session? So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our second item on the list. So Chang.
Great, wonderful. So thanks for that very interesting discussion. So the second question is sort of the opposite of the first question, which is how can teaching inform our research, or even is it possible to do research through teaching? So we're going to start with Linus, who's going to talk about a specific example from his own research, and then we'll go to Rita and Brian. So Linus, the floor is yours.
Yes, so I wanted to talk about something that was like one project that came out of teaching, that's something that was done in the classroom that led into a research project. It was not done at my own universities because we don't have enough students, but it's something where a collaborator of mine who's at Technical University of Hamburg-Harburg, we discussed this for a long time and we came across this, and Christoph had the opportunity to teach a lean entrepreneurship class over a period of 13 weeks. And he did this with a massive amount of students. So he could do this for multiple years. And we involved more than 900 students over 2.5 years that went through the training. And the experiment that we implemented in this particular case, after getting ethics approval from the university and so forth, was to get some students to select the team members that they want to work with. Others were randomly assigned. Some people had the opportunity to choose the idea, and other people were randomly assigned an idea. So it was a 2x2 design, and we randomly allocated the 900 students. They get the same training by tutors who are unknown to the experiment, and then we invite seasoned entrepreneurs and business angels and venture capitalists to come in and evaluate the pitch decks that they delivered after those 13 weeks. I think this was like a super fun experiment to actually run in class. We learned a lot from it. Maybe there are things that don't yet necessarily generalize outside of classes, and that managers are different and so forth. But I think it was really quite rewarding to think about it. It was nice in the sense that we got access to everyone had to fill in the survey before doing the class as well. So we had 100% response rate coming into it. So we knew a lot about the information that did this. We obviously could trace like the complete behaviors during the class, but also how well they organize and so forth afterwards. And I think it was like a super interesting experiment that involved an enormous amount of resources as well to find tutors, to trace them, to be able to actually perform everything that had to be done. But I think the outcomes were nice, and we learned something and that I'm now actually adopting and using in the classroom afterwards. I think one thing that we learned is that more than just getting like the ethics approval from a university and standardizing grades across treatments and so forth, I think one thing is that I discussed this with other colleagues at other universities as well, that I think we as a community can actually potentially use the classrooms to actually get good insights about research and sorry, and organize different kinds of data collection efforts as well. I know, sorry, I know Oliver and I got something in my throat, sorry. I know Oliver, Schilke, and Henning. Henning is organizing these workshops with 10,000s of people, and they're running different kinds of experiments on these particular workshops. But I think the classroom in itself is such a nice experiment to be able to run and to collectively actually use data collection across universities. I think would be the future as well. And I think it would be much better to advance the field than running multiple smaller ones that we have been doing in the past. So I would really hope that this is something that we can potentially do as a community.
Great, thank you, Linus, for that. And now we'll go to Rita.
So I had a couple of similar thoughts. First, I kind of think about this question of sort of classroom as a field site in two different ways, or classroom as a sort of a enriching for your research question, two different ways. So there's the indirect benefits. So I feel very energized after teaching. So that's got to help keep all of us healthy and excited about going back to the office and doing research. So that's one benefit. You know, you have deadlines, you focus, and you're forced to apply theory to practice. So that's ought to have good benefits if you can manage the time properly, right? On the more direct benefits of kind of this idea of classroom as field site that Linus was talking about, I have two separate experiences. One is sort of a partial experience with lean startup data, a very recent project where one of our PhD students, Mike Leatherby, and I started looking at classes at Stanford that used the lean startup method and realized that, you know, if we would get the data, that would actually make a really interesting study. You know, do they use hypotheses? How do they test them? You know, what does it mean to go and leave the building and test your hypotheses? So we didn't end up using the class data. We ended up going to National Science Foundation and getting their implementation of lean startup and sort of more standardized way and, you know, across the nation kind of data. But that seeing how that lean startup process was, how students used it in the classroom was definitely a motivation for Mike's dissertation and then the SEJ that came out of it. And by the by, check out the video abstract. It's super cool. We got Steve Blank as one of the stars in that video abstract. So, you know, students were clicking on that link like crazy. So that's an example. If you can get in a practitioner to speak as part of your video abstract, I think it would enrich those research abstracts a lot. The second quick experience I wanted to mention about using research or using classroom as your research field site. So in the same Kathy Eisenhardt's class many years ago, she was using a simulation called MarkStrat in the class, and I ended up teaching another section of the same class. So we realized pretty soon that this might actually be a research site for us. And one of our PhD students, Eric Chen, started collecting the data. These students play a marketing strategy game. It's pretty realistic. Some of you may still be using it, good and bad of teamwork, weekly rounds of strategy decisions. You're competing against peers. So all of this is really good stuff. Another good point was that it seemed fresh and didn't age very quickly. So they didn't really update the simulation much, which was really good for research purposes. So we got all of the data from our various incarnations of the class, so across many years. And so we were able to publish an SMJ, Life in the Fast Lane is the title, and then another SEJ. And there's a third one to make the stream that's still in the works on sequences of decision making. So that was my experience of how teaching actually directly contributed to research or enriched both sides. And now I'm turning it over to Brian.
Sure. Okay, thanks. So I'll talk about a couple of examples where my research has benefited from the teaching. I think they're a little bit, I'm thinking of them as slightly different from the ones we've heard. In general, the two ways that I've benefited, I think, are first from hearing the practical challenges that students face in their jobs. They talk, they complain, and in particular, the ones that seem to be outliers from what I would expect from theory, whatever. And then the second is going to be grabbing data from the students. So both of these, maybe it's kind of obvious, it's easy. This may work better when you're teaching executives than when you're teaching, MBAs or undergrads who may have a different level of experience and responsibility in organizations on which they can draw. But the first example I'll give, and the real world of this example isn't quite as clean and neat as this sounds, but I'll make it sound like it was just one seamless thing. Teaching something about managing innovation and strategy, and then hearing and something about teams, which I don't know a huge amount about, but I can fake it. And someone involved in managing a lot of R&D saying, the challenge is these people who have different political, basically the inventors who are Democrats are yelling at the inventors who are Republicans all the time, or vice versa. And so they're not really getting, it's kind of a hassle sometimes to put them together. And that ended up, I hadn't thought that would be an issue. And even though there's rumor that there's increased polarization politically in recent years. So this ended up leading to a project with John DeFigueiredo and a PhD student named Trajit Sethi that is still underway. We're just beginning to present it around, but the idea is I'm very excited about this work on inventor ideology or affiliation and the impact for innovation teams and then the consequences of those innovation teams. That wouldn't really have, I don't think I would have gotten there as quickly if it weren't for this conversation with this, or this pushback from students in class. So the idea that, they say that doesn't make sense to me, or I face this issue and what you're talking about doesn't deal with that. Oh, you know what, maybe I should study that issue. Then as far as data, and I'm going to credit one of my colleagues, a stats professor, Waleed Hijazi, for this. You're teaching, especially if you're teaching executives, something like on anything, you frequently say, write about your company, right? That's obviously what matters to them, motivates them. And it's also a good learning experience for us. So Waleed in the stats course gets some data from your company on whatever problem you're trying to solve and, write something about it. And once every couple of years, the report ends up indicating these data would actually be incredibly good for studying something that we often write about. And then Waleed sort of puts his arm around the executive and charms the person and so on. So Waleed and I have a paper that's based on a large data set from a company that will remain nameless, where on a topic that I personally find fascinating about piece rate, people who are paid piece rate versus people who are paid by the day, and what that means for their performance outcomes, some of which look exactly like what you'd expect in terms of the piece rate guys work faster but sloppier, and some of which are different than you might expect in ways that I find interesting. I hope someday to convince you are interesting as well. The key point of this is sometimes you gain access to data, almost third-party data sources through this kind of stuff. So that's what I've got. I'll stop now.
Great. Well, thank you, Rita, Brian, and Linus for that. So before we move on to the general Q&A, does anyone have any questions about the second question specifically? If you do, feel free to use the raise hand function, and we could take a couple of questions about how teaching informs research before we move on to just general Q&A about anything on your mind. Great, wonderful. With that, then we'll just move into the general Q&A section. This is the last section of this event. So if you have any questions about any topics we discussed today, feel free to raise your hand, and the panelists will be able to take your questions.
Thank you, Chang. And I believe we'll start with Leo. There was some discussion in the chat already, but why don't you ask that to everybody?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrea and Chang, for organizing. Thank you all the panelists for sharing with us your practices. One thing that I was wondering if that some podcasts like Freakonomics on NPR, they are usually very useful in translating research to broader audiences. Do you make use of podcasts, videos, movies to connect to research? And do you recommend doing so? If you can share a little bit of your experience on that. Thank you.
So I'll get us started. So I'm studying antitrust and the power of platforms with Shruti Thatchingari right now. So we're using the old Microsoft case as a natural experiment. So what I've found really interesting is there are some econ podcasts around this topic that would be really interesting for if this were a classroom setting. I haven't used them yet because they're really long, and it would take some effort to find the good bits. But I really like this idea, Leo. It's a super great idea, and Linus, I think, put a couple of great thoughts also in chat about where to go, but I haven't, but I think I should. I just haven't gotten around this, that they're all so long. Brian, do you have a solution?
So it's a really interesting, they're really interesting and appealing, and I'm a little ambivalent about them. So I've used a couple of these things, not necessarily from Freakonomics, but from similar sources occasionally where I just link them. My ambivalence actually goes back to something that I think piggybacks on something Linus said before about wanting to have the students think about what the answer is before you actually reveal the answer, which I think is very important. And my concern with a lot of the things that are out there that we could use is that they sort of end up spoon feeding the stuff so students can be quite passive without thinking about whether it really makes sense. Which is the main reason I shy away from those in many cases, but not all. But where that comes down to is it depends, I think, on what your goal is. Do you want to get these ideas there to the students really fast, or do you want them to wrestle with it and think about it before you sort of reveal this stuff? Linus, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I agree with what you said. Like, look, I think it's good depending on your objective. Like sometimes if you want to spoon fit them something that they could consume on the go as like a background reading, I think like somehow I built this are amazing on like founder stories. And then obviously if you have that in back of your mind that this is something else that you want to use this for afterwards and introduce more research or something that is a bit more advanced than what they discuss in the podcast, then I think it's great. But I think it really depends on your objective. one thing I just wanted to say is that our school has invested quite heavily in like online teaching. And one thing that we learned from the students is that many students also would like our teaching to be consumed as a podcast so that they can go through like our classes when they are at the gym. So I think there's something to be said about like consuming some material on the go as like a background reading before coming to class. And I also see this, that when there's actually like another reading, that many of them convert them into audio so that they can consume it in the car or on the underground going to the office or something like this. So I think there's something to be said about like for some things actually using podcasts.
Okay, so I have another question. So I wonder if we could make this even more specific. Do the panelists have specific topics that they think really benefit from current research? Are there things where you always would bring in for a certain topic? So you look up and make sure that you have some kind of current research topic, whether it's your own research or other people's research. So like really trying to make this more specific.
So two strategy topics where I would always use what's going on currently is the big bucket of corporate social responsibility, because that research is moving so fast. And platforms is another topic. Of course, that's a very broad one, but there's always something going on, either, you know, Europe, North America. So those would be my two picks if I had to pick.
Oh, thank you. Corporate social responsibility seems like a really great one from the research, right? As opposed to textbooks and, I mean, current events and research, right? Those are important things to bring in. Thank you. What about the others?
So I agree with those. This obviously plays to my own personal interests, but the organizational economics literature, whatever around boundary of the firm that's going on, I'm very eager always to bring that in. And it's kind of obvious why.
I think, like, interestingly, like many of the papers that I bring in class that are very contemporary are stuff that are just coming out that I think have an interesting method. So I really thought this Millikan paper, for example, in Nature, on like when they come up with different kinds of ideas for how can you encourage people to go to the gym and become like a loyal gym person. And when they ask people to like generate different kinds of interventions, and then they have forecasters to think about it. This is something I discussed with my EMBA class. I thought it was to be something that would be discussed like very shortly. And people were like super excited about like, what does it mean? How well can we forecast things? How should you organize differently as a result? Maybe we think too much about some interventions of like that we currently implement inside our organization, and that we have like a blind spot out there. How can we test them? How can we base our decisions on much more informed evidence? I think that's one recent example that I just brought in that I thought was an interesting one. But I think there are many things that are just coming out, but I actually oftentimes use them because I have an interesting method that can be discussed.
So I'd love to hear from people in the audience as well, if there are certain topics, I mean, in the chat if you want, but if there's certain topics that you also make sure to include current research when you teach. I'll add my comments. Divestment, I said before, I don't think textbooks and I don't think a lot of the cases deal very well with divestment. And so divestment, I think, is one where I bring my research into that. And then, as I said, I have access to the population of US multinational corporations. And so for me, bringing in some current research on global strategies and different decisions that they make across emerging markets in particular is something where I bring my own research in there too. So I think, and for me, like the general cases don't always cover things as well. So adding that at the end, I think helps to put the conversation into a more kind of practical light. But I'd love to hear others in the comments.
Could Andrea and Cheng chime in as well? I think you had great ideas on this topic.
Well, if there's anybody in the audience, you're most welcome to jump in. I teach an entrepreneurship course, and so I try, and a lot of the course is sort of inspired by the Lean Startup, which is something I'm really interested in. So I try to look at research that gives some more depth to that kind of tools. Chang, I'll have more, but Chang, you go.
Yeah, no, I feel like the students actually, I teach a strategy class, and the students really like some of the classical theoretical frameworks we have. You know, you think about VRIO with resource-based views. The students really like to think about really, you know, what makes something hard to imitate. We talk about socially complex resources, you know, time discontinuous effects, things like that. I think so. Complex theory can be boiled down into sort of these bite-sized nuggets that students often find really helpful, especially if you apply these theories we have against the current events, right? So oftentimes when I start a class, I would pull an article from the Wall Street Journal and try to apply a stylized version of either the resource-based view or some other framework we have to have the students analyze it. And I think just the reps of sort of doing this before every class sort of helps students build confidence in applying their strategy toolkit, which is often very theoretical and abstract. And so I've had some good luck with that approach on my end.
I had a quick question actually for if you don't mind, Chang. I've always envied Kathy because she's a case researcher and she always has an example and in-depth story about a case that, a case from her research that fits the teaching case. So you are a qualitative researcher as well. Are you able to make those links in the classroom?
Yes, so sometimes, oftentimes there'd be qualitative academic studies, and oftentimes the students actually really enjoy reading those because it's a little more accessible to them, especially if they haven't had so sophisticated econometrics training for some of the quantitative papers we've had. But oftentimes these qualitative papers often also have an HBR equivalent too. So I could sometimes assign the HBR equivalent and then sort of saying, oh, if you want to see how this was done, here's like the ASQ or the FMJ underlying the HBR article. But yeah, I think just with the Eisenhardt multi-case method, students intuitively find that really easy to grasp. Sort of like the horse race between 5 firms that started at the same spot. So yeah, Rita, that's actually a great idea. Just I think we've talked a lot about quantitative research, but oftentimes qualitative research can be a bridge between academia and teaching MBAs and BBAs and execs because it is a little more accessible than just the statistics. So thanks for that great insight.
Actually, if I can jump in for a second, this is triggered by Cheng's use of the word horse race, but I'm going to take it in a different direction. I think to some degree, sometimes there's a sense that research leads to a particular answer, or at least in any one study, there's this answer, and that's where we end up, although you may still ask the students to question it beforehand, as Linus was talking about. I've actually found it very useful to, we don't always agree with each other in the papers that we write, and I've found it useful to assign to students sometimes 2 papers on the same basic topic that come to different conclusions. And it's not to then say which wins the horse race, but to try to get the students to say, how do we make sense of the fact that, these are smart folks, trust me, I know them, they're smart folks, and they're writing in similar areas, but they end up coming to these different conclusions. How would you square this? What makes sense? What pieces would you put together? What new model would you build in your minds to take advantage of this? And that works well in electives. I wouldn't try it in the core as much, I don't think, but I've had good luck in electives with that.
Linus, do you want to jump in on that?
Just one thing that I wanted to say, because I think Cheng is a great qualitative researcher and Kathy as well, obviously. I think my experience with quant research is actually very different, that I think it works pretty well, but I think it works relatively well to use in the classroom of talking more about it if it's something that is an experiment, because it's much easier, as long as randomization works as intended, it's easy to think about and interpret for the students. It's not as sophisticated as perhaps like something where you, in the absence of like a true experiment with randomization. And sometimes the qualitative papers that are out there, I think sometimes they're using like too big words. And even if there are like no tables for them to actually understand, there's so much like grandiose language that makes it difficult for at least some of my students to actually digest. So I think I personally had more luck with things that are more of like an experiment that you can use inside the classroom. But I think like we all have different perspective, and obviously there are much great qualitative research out there that can be used. But I think the experiments actually work pretty well in the classroom.
So Linus, when you say that, do you mean you run like a mini version of the research experiment again with your current set of students? It's small, but like an opening exercise or closing exercise?
Sometimes I do if I have enough students. So like when I do it online, so I teach sometimes online when you have like 90 people, and then you can do things and showcase that, like, look, this actually plays out the way that you were intended. I'd also do forecasting exercises. So like, look, this is what the research says. There are different views to Brian's points, that it could go this way, it could go this way. It could be like a horse race between the two, or it could be 3 different kinds of options. Like, which one do you think has an effect in the end? How big do you think the effect size would be? And then you see like, this is what the research and what it says. You thought it would be like this big and had this kind of effect, and it actually turns out to be slightly different. And here's the reason for why you actually thought this was not the case. So I have one thing where I've done like myself, I actually found something that I didn't expect to find, and I used this in the classroom to showcase and like, look, we just vastly overestimate how big we think the effect is. And then I try to explain why this is actually the case, and it's like, oh. And I think the upside of this is that you also, in the process of understanding that, get a good sense about what research is actually like.
Thank you, folks. I believe John made a comment. Do you want to jump in, John?
I'm not sure you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I found it really great to be back in the classroom after 2 years. But the students' opinion on the long cases and the kind of classic content had changed somewhat over the the course of the lockdown. And so I just started to introduce more research into my teaching the core strategy course this year. And I found that there's some really great SMJ articles that really do translate into real handy assignments, such as the way that Linus was describing. And so I would just encourage people to, if you read an SMJ or any other article, and it can jump out to you as like, well, this is a question we can ask students, or here's a little framework we can put to the students to test them. It can really be beneficial and help people move away from those long Harvard cases, which I think they have their value, but they're also becoming quite outdated in terms of the modern approach to teaching. So that's just my point, especially if you have a blended format. It allows you to do much more stuff.
Any thoughts on this, Rita, I believe?
I actually have a follow-up question. I think this is a great point. I find exactly the same phenomenon, that attention spans are shorter now. I wonder, is anybody, of course you give full credit, but is anybody taking the text of a long reading, not necessarily a case, but a long reading, and then sort of condensing and shortening it for the students, like as part of the course pack, like, maybe highlighting, maybe only giving parts of the long reading? Of course, you will pay copyright and all that stuff, but is anybody doing that? Like
I have for years anyway. I mean, I always highlight the stuff that I really want them to read. I've done that for years, but John, I completely agree with you. It sounds like Rita does too. So it sounds like it's pervasive across many continents here, that students are not liking the long reading assignments anymore, and actually just not doing them and not getting as much out of them. So it's a problem. Seems to be a problem we're all facing.
I'm very curious about Alex's comment. I break the Netflix case into 3 days. How do you do it? How does it help? Oh, sorry, no audio.
So I do that too. I sometimes have a case for 2 days and I make it clear, this is the case you're reading for 2 days. So make sure you're reading the entire case. We're going to talk about it for 2 days. I'm not sure, perhaps that's what Alex is doing as well. Streaming 3rd day.
So Alex is typing her responses here, everybody. Yeah.
But maybe this is where podcasts and like the video abstract that Rita was mentioning are actually useful, right? That you can give people some pre-material. I think the problem sometimes is that it requires more work on our behalf, that rather than just giving people the same cases that we did in the past, that we have to rethink our own teaching and ask different kinds of questions in the classroom afterwards. But maybe one can do this for like continuously, instead of giving people like 10 cases over a class, instead of like reducing it down to 8 in 1 year, and over time trying to like replace them with other things as well. Because I also think that some of these cases are excessively long sometimes and too much of a burden, especially if you teach executive participants that don't have the attention span of reading like a 25 pages case.
Grace, we have time. We're close to the end line here, but Grace, do you want to briefly ask your question, and then we'll probably have to wrap up?
Oh yeah, sure. No worries. This is just a quick question. So when talking about research, students tend to become quiet and just sit there listening, waiting for answers, instead of like for case studies, case discussions, they tend to talk a lot. So I always wondered how to involve student participation or inspire students to speak up during research topics in class. Yeah, thanks.
So this is where it's useful, I think, to sometimes have two articles that don't necessarily agree, or the HBR equivalents, or small management review equivalents of those that don't necessarily agree. One thing I picked up, I think it was Ajay Agrawal, who I watched teach once, and he did this, which I thought was nice. When doing these kinds of articles, he would have the students, it's thesis, logic, evidence. What's the thesis that the authors are trying to provide here? What's the logic by which they argue it, and what's the evidence, and do you believe it? And by pushing students to think of it that way, by imitating him, I've had luck at getting them to be pretty talkative, especially in electives, less so in core, around these types of issues. And so that's the way, those are the questions I've used to try to elicit something out of them. I'll turn it over to others.
I love the horse race idea too, and these two articles, contradicting viewpoints. What I've done in my innovation class, and this requires a lot of work, but in every class, I have an opening exercise and a closing exercise. And I try to take some of the experiments from the innovation literature, and then I run them with my students. And often they don't work, and that's actually even better because that generates a lot of discussion. But that, I don't lecture, but we try it first and try to figure out what I'm about to lecture. So that's my idea.
Yeah, so we have pretty talkative students. I rarely have the problem to getting students to talk. I almost have like the reverse problem in getting them to stop. If I have this problem, I think to Brian's point, like maybe you can take it a step further and dividing the class into two camps, like breaking them out in an exercise. Like, look, you're going to make the argument for, you're going to make the argument against, and do it more like a debate challenge, perhaps, to get people to actually discuss it in class. That would be like a good start if people are very silent, because then they are supposed to make the argument very much in one direction and not just immediately reach like an agreement or a consensus decision.
Thanks.
I'll come back one last time. The other thing I mentioned at the very beginning, how much I think it's useful to have a board plan of how you want the board to look at the end. That's not just for case discussions, that's also for discussions of research, I think. And so if you've taken the time, so when I know what it is I want the board to look like in terms of the pros and cons or trying to make sense of something, that helps me ask the right questions to try to elicit things out of the students so they start talking.
Well, thank you folks very much. This was a really, really fascinating discussion. Lots of great advice for everybody, especially for junior people and PhD students. So that was really great. We would love to keep discussing, but in interest of time, we promised everybody we will be done by 1 p.m. Eastern. So thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone.